button. Yeah, the live stream option.
Oh, it says preparing to live stream the webinar. Did I just do this a little too soon?
Oh, you might have, but that's okay. You can pause it. You can stop it.
Oh, I can. Okay.
Yeah, and then you can restart it. So if you go back under more and stop the live stream.
Yeah, I did pause it and I also muted it.
Oh,
That's
perfect.
Key, isn't it?
Yep.
Okay.
Excellent. So now let me go and look. It should be paused. And then once you restore it, then YouTube will start receiving the signal again.
Okay, that's good. You can get that going early.
Yep.
We're learning all the tricks of the trade, Juan. Someday you will not have to show up at these meetings.
Yay! No. I'm happy to help.
Yeah, I must say I was glad to see you in there.
Yes.
I think it might still be receiving.
The YouTube.
Yeah. Because it looks like it is.
What do you mean? Like I didn't really pause it?
No, it doesn't look like it paused. Let me look again and see.
Juan, I'm looking at it too from the public view, and it says
It suggests
public hearing at 9 a.m. But it doesn't. It's just showing the screen for City of Bend, official video from the City of Bend.
And if you click in the middle and play.
No, there's nowhere to click.
Oh, okay. Perfect then. Let me.
I do see those three buttons do allow me to stop the live stream. So yeah, I guess it is streaming because it.
Let me looking here and see. Let me play it instead of playing it from YouTube. Oh, it is still coming through. Yeah, because I don't see anybody, but I see the captioning and I can hear the audio coming through. So through. And good morning, Ms. Marshall. I think the floor is yours.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Stephanie Marshall. I'm the City of Bend Hearings Officer assigned to this matter today. Today is Tuesday, May 11th, 2021. It is 9:02 a.m. And the matter before me concerns project numbers PL-20-0702 for a conditional use permit application, file number PL-20-0703, site plan design review, and PL-VAR 2021-0039 Class B variance application. This matter is continued from a prior public hearing on, I believe it was March 16, 2021. At the hearing at that time, the applicant requested a continuation so they could submit another modification of application to the site plan and design review and the conditional use permit. The modification was submitted on March 30th and was complete on April 6th, thus constituting an application. And the date for this matter was actually set on March 16th, and public notice went out on that. I'm going to go through a few introductory statements and remarks, and then we're going to turn it over to the city to describe participation in this Zoom public hearing. As an initial matter, I have no interest in the application, the subject of the application, nor the applicant or their representative. I've had no ex parte contacts, which means I've not been contacted by any party, including the city or the city's agents regarding the application, other than receiving documents which are part of the record. I've received, among other things, a revised staff recommendation, a memorandum prepared by the applicant's consultant, and also a letter prepared by the applicant, all of which have been submitted and are part of the record. I believe that I can conduct and decide this matter in a fair and impartial manner. At this time, I would ask if there are any participants that have an objection to my hearing this matter today. I'm leaving extra time given our remote hearing. Okay, hearing none. I'd like to also review the fact that the decision that I will be writing are based on the standards as set forth in the staff recommendation in the record as identified by the applicant and its attorney. If there are any standards that you believe should be directed for my attention or consideration, please do so in writing. Or bring it up to me today in writing if the record's left open. I need to be more clear here. And in oral testimony today, if there is something that you believe that should be considered that is not set forth. This is the raise it or waive it rule. If you wish to appeal any decision of mine in the future and believe that I made a mistake based on something that was not brought to my attention, you will not be permitted to use that as a basis for your appeal. I think at this point, that concludes my introductory remarks. I'd like to turn it over to the city to review how participation for this remote hearing will occur today. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Marshall. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. This is a public hearing, so the public will have an opportunity to provide testimony as allowed by the hearings officer. When the time comes to do that, please use the raise hand function in Zoom. Click on that icon in the middle of your screen. Your hand will be raised, and so a member of the staff will call on you based in the order of hands being received. As we call on you, please provide your first name, last name, and your address for the record, and proceed with your testimony. And let me double check. I am not seeing any phone number, so I will spare the phone number instructions. So, or for the instructions for those on the phone. So that's all I have at this time, Madam Hearings Officer. So
thank you. Thank you so much. All right. So the way the hearing is going to proceed is I'm going to hear from staff to begin with, and then I'm going to hear testimony from the applicant. Then I'm going to hear testimony from any member of the public, whom wishes to provide testimony in favor of, neutral to, or in opposition to the application. At that point, I will turn it back over to staff, and then final comments or testimony from the applicant. So I will now turn it over to Ms. Anselman for the city.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here for a presentation. Thanks again. My name is Sarah Anselman. I'm an associate planner for the City of Bend. First, the project site is comprised of 2 units of land. As described in the recommendation, only tax lot 1700 was found to be a legal lot of record. Tax lot 1601 was separated by deed after Deschutes County adopted their partition ordinance, and the applicant did not provide evidence of a recorded survey or land use action for that land division. A full analysis as well as possible remedies are included in the recommendation. For clarity on the scope of the site, because I know this is a little bit confusing, this image shows the project boundary. The RS, RM, and PF zoned portions of the properties to the west are not included in this application. The project site is only the ME and CG zoned areas. So the city is recommending denial of the application for multiple reasons, and I won't go into detail about each one as they're all included in the recommendation, but I will cover the items with the greatest impact. First, the dedication for a roundabout at Murphy Road and the frontage road. The frontage road will eventually provide access to the properties to the south of the site, which are all currently undeveloped, as well as be the primary on-off route for Highway 97 in this area of town. Construction of the roundabout is not required under this project because traffic counts do not meet the construction mitigation failure criteria. However, the need for intersection improvements are anticipated as the area develops. Additionally, this roundabout is shown on the Murphy Crossing street plan map. The applicant was provided with the opportunity to submit a conceptual design for the roundabout at Murphy Road and the frontage road, and they did not. They simply stated that there's adequate right-of-way, but without illustrating how that existing right-of-way is sufficient for a roundabout. And that additional right-of-way is for a large drainage swale on the north side of Murphy Road. It's not simply excess right-of-way. Because there's an existing water well nearby, which I'll talk about more in a minute, underground injection control stormwater solutions like your typical catch basin to dry wells can't be used. So this swale is serving a purpose in that right of way to the north side of Murphy Road. We know that the roundabout will require some modification to the existing swale, but it can't simply be eliminated or replaced. And we don't even know if a roundabout would even fit entirely within the existing right-of-way. So the applicant has not met their burden of proof showing how the planned roundabout can be accommodated within the existing right-of-way, nor have they provided the dedication required if it cannot. The necessity of dedication for this roundabout will affect the building setbacks on site A and D, the landscape calculations, and a few design elements of the site layout will likely change. With this many variables, staff can't make findings for several standards, nor can staff recommend conditions of approval. Further south along the frontage road, the Murphy Crossing street plan also requires a roundabout at the intersection of the frontage road with B Street. The applicant's proposal doesn't generate the high number of vehicle trips contemplated by the refinement plan, but it is the first proposal within the Murphy Crossing refinement plan. Therefore, there's an unknown number of trips to be generated by future development in the area, as well as by the future extension of the frontage road to Highway 97. Construction of the roundabout is not required, but to meet the standards of the Murphy Crossing street plan map, the applicant must adhere to an assumed setback for the roundabout. An assumed setback is less impactful than dedication because it doesn't alter the site area, so calculations like landscaping aren't affected. But adhering to the setback will require that sites B and C are redesigned somewhat, which ultimately can affect the setback and possibly the design review and the frontage type. It was determined that the proposal doesn't warrant, it was determined that the proposal does not produce enough trips to warrant full street widening of Murphy Road, but a left turn pocket is required, which will require some street widening. But first, the traffic analysis memo required a 100-foot turn pocket, and the applicant is only proposing 73.5 feet. And I want to note that this was incorrectly stated as 56 feet in the recommendation, although it is still short of the traffic analysis memo requirement. And second, the civil plans submitted with the proposal do not address the impact of street widening. The relocated curb on Murphy Road, which would be part of the street widening, requires a cascade of improvements, which the applicant has not sufficiently illustrated, such as the relocation of catch basin inlets, effects on the drainage swale to the north of Murphy Road, relocation of sidewalk, especially in relation to manholes, and reestablishing the landscape strip. The applicant is showing curb-tight sidewalks which aren't permitted. The quantity of variables associated with improvements to Murphy Road are too complex to condition, so the special street standard for Murphy Road and the related findings were found not to be met. The applicant is proposing a 60-foot right-of-way for the frontage road and to construct it to the local special street standard rather than to the collector special street standard in an 80-foot right-of-way as required by the Murphy Crossing street plan map. The number of trips associated with the development does not change the functional classification of the roadway, nor can the classification of the road be changed through a limited land use decision or a permit. An amendment to the TSP, and in this case, the Murphy Crossing refinement plan as well, would be necessary to change the classification in special street section. The collector standard specified in the refinement plan requires bike lanes, sufficient lane widths, a turn lane or median, on-street parking, and widened sidewalks. The applicant did not provide sufficient information to determine how or if a partial street width can fit within a 60-foot right-of-way, therefore not meeting their burden of proof. Public right-of-way stormwater solutions were also not addressed by the applicant. As I mentioned earlier, an existing water well in the area causes a portion of the site to be located within the 2-year time of travel. Underground injection controls are not permitted within a 2-year time of travel area, so swales are likely required. If swales cannot be fully located within right-of-way, either additional right-of-way is needed or the swales may be located on a private site, but they may conflict with building footprints or other elements of the site. The applicant did not illustrate that the existing swale north of Murphy Road has sufficient capacity for the additional impervious surface from widening Murphy Road. Without additional information addressing stormwater runoff and drainage in the public right-of-way, the associated standards cannot be found to be met and present too many variables to condition. Last, I'll briefly summarize a few other not met standards. Regarding tree removal, staff was not able to find a single tree indicated to be protected. Rather, the trees are either unmarked or indicated to be removed. Therefore, it's unknown exactly which trees will be removed versus preserved. The block length and perimeter standards for the south half of the site were not found to be met. Portions of the public plazas, the elements integral to making them plazas were located within clear vision areas. Comments from private development engineering stated that some street intersections are askew. Streets must intersect at a right angle as much as practical, which may affect setbacks and sighting when remedied. And I'll note the Murphy Crossing refinement plan allows streets to shift up to 30 feet without an amendment. Last, the location of the access drive into the campground is such that it jogs up to locate the campground out of the ME zone that's shown in the image in the lower left, if you can see my mouse. It locates the campground out of the ME zone where it's not a permitted use. It basically follows the zone line, which isn't shown on this particular side. By jogging the drive, an existing sewer manhole is placed within the curb line, and to meet the block length and perimeter standards for the portion of Site D north of this access drive, staff recommended a sidewalk along the south side of the access road to meet the block length and perimeter standards. But that places the manhole within the sidewalk. So without a design by the applicant, it's unclear how the campground can be maintained out of the ME zone and the manhole can be located out of the sidewalk section and the curb flow lines. In conclusion, staff recommends denial of the application for the reasons described. And if other city staff has anything to add, I'd like to turn it over to them at this time. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Anselin. Are there any other staff members, Mr. Henningsen, or anyone else on staff, Ian, that wishes to testify in support of the city's recommendation?
Yeah, I would just like to point out, or further clarify Sarah's stance on the need of the collector street through there. As clearly identified by Sarah, the not only the master plan or the overlay area of the project clearly identifies that as a collector, but it is absolutely known even in the current TSP that the city adopted recently, that that road will be a connector to 97. It will eventually be the main connector over the highway connecting China Hat and Ponderosa and bringing further traffic into the area, further clarifying the need for that roundabout. I don't know that there's any way to clearly just ignore that fact that eventually some kind of mitigation is going to be needed at those intersections.
Okay, thank you. All right. Anyone else from the city? Any other staff person from the city? Okay, all right. I will turn it over to the applicant, Mr. Kobach.
Okay, I should be unmuted. Can you hear me? All right. Good morning, Hearings Officer Marshall. Good to see you again. Chris Kobach on behalf of the applicant. I'm going to take the lead as I have in the past and then introduce some of the team as needed to talk about some of the more technical issues. I'm going to go kind of in the order that staff went. I agree. We as a team, you've seen our submission. We tend to agree there are a couple fundamental issues up front that need to be addressed. And we've always advised staff and the hearings officer that you'd have to make a decision on a couple of these fundamental issues that raise legal issues. And then towards the end of the presentation, I'll be going through what we've labeled in our submission letter as site plan issues. And those largely, I think exclusively, can be dealt with through conditions. And we've given you this morning evidence to show how feasible it is to condition those issues. And I won't spend as much time on those. To begin with, on the lot of record, you received an analysis from someone I know you know, Liz Fancher, somebody that's well respected in the county for her lot of record work. And Liz found something that the county staff and I was unable to find in the records, which is a partition plat for lot 1601. We didn't believe it was required because, and Liz can explain this in the open record period if we have one, that back then when deed split property and one side of that property went with an existing parcel owned by the same person, the county treated that as a lot line adjustment, which didn't require a partition. And so in 1978, Mr. Romaine and Mr. Cox had a deal where they split 1601 after Mr. Romaine got a land use approval. 7 acres went over to Mr. Romaine because he owned the property next door. It was called Romaine Village. And it's been part of Romaine Village, it's been conveyed with that separate property, 1500, forever. So under the county's treatment of this back then, it would not have been a partition. And that would have explained why a partition plat was not required. But nonetheless, Ms. Fancher was able to find a partition plat for 1601. You have a copy of it. And we believe that puts that matter to bed. But, you know, I agree with staff that worst case, we've got two alternatives. We have an application for a lot of record verification with the county. County has accepted it. They believe they have jurisdiction to make a determination because it was back when the property was there. And that's pending at the county. And we're confident based on the partition plat and what we've heard from them, they will confirm what we've always believed. And second, we could, through lot consolidation and partition, correct any lot of record problem now that 1700 is confirmed as a lot of record, even in staff's view. So moving on to some of the more substantive issues here, I'm going to start with an issue staff did not address with you this morning. And that is a shift in the position from the last staff report to the revised staff report, basically that I interpret as kind of rewriting the standards in the Murphy refinement plan to make what is an expressly permitted outright use prohibited. And staff gets there by saying, you know, we're going to incorporate we're going to borrow from BDC 2.2800, the Central City Business District Design Standards, and we're going to incorporate those into the Murphy Refinement Plan. And if you read .I.8 of that section, the staff interprets that to require pedestrian-oriented uses. And staff goes on to say that because RV storage and mini storage can never be a pedestrian-oriented use, these can never be approved. Staff's position is dependent exclusively upon its subjective interpretation of the purpose statements for the Murphy Refinement Plan. And we've given you a legal analysis that our Court of Appeals has confirmed you must apply when interpreting a local provision. And it tells you, and I know you know this, you've done this analysis a number of times, I'm sure, is you have to start with the text and context of the provision. And the text is most important. I mean, in the Gaines case, the court came out and said, even if there's formal legislative history, you cannot use legislative history to change the text of the provision. And in this case, the text of the provision in the permitted uses expressly states that these uses are permitted in the zone. And you cannot use a subjective interpretation of a purpose statement to change that. The other thing is staff's subjective view of what should happen there is not even legislative history. So it doesn't even rise to the level of legislative history that the court in Gaines said you cannot use to change the substantive provisions in the code. So for that reason, we think the position that staff takes that these are not permitted uses because they're not pedestrian oriented is just against the law. It's contrary to any of the accepted methodology for interpreting local provisions. And more importantly, if you read the purpose statement, it doesn't say anywhere all uses must be pedestrian oriented. It says that one of the purposes is to offer opportunities for pedestrian oriented. Well, there are opportunities. We're just not proposing those, and we're not required to propose those because we're proposing permitted uses under the development standards. So actually, nothing we're doing is inconsistent with the purpose at all. Now, we also talk a little bit in our letter, well, actually quite a bit, about whether or not staff can interject the Central City design standards at all. And here's where I think, staff got it wrong. The chart in the Murphy Refinement Plan has a box that goes across all zones, and it says design review as required by section 2.1900 and 2.2800. It doesn't say that all uses are subject to those provisions. It says those uses are subject to design review as required by those two provisions. Now, if you read those two provisions, they do not apply to any of the uses we've proposed. And now on 2.1900, that's multifamily, staff agrees. It reads the provision differently than it's written. Staff reads it as required by 2.19 or 2.2800. That's not what it reads. It says both. So even staff's position on how that language applies is inconsistent internally. But if you read the provisions in 2.190, it doesn't apply to any of our uses. And likewise, if you read the provision 2.2800, it does not apply to any of the uses because we're not in the central business zone. Now, staff points out that it's subjective view. Well, it doesn't make any sense that we would make that reference if we didn't intend it to apply to uses in the Murphy Refinement Plan. Well, it's not the hearings officer's job to go back and rewrite the code or to try to figure out from some subjective assumptions what the legislative body intended. You are asked or told by the court to read the text and determine from the text what the legislative body intended. And here, the text is very clear. Design review for the uses proposed are as required by those two specific sections, and you have to read those sections and apply them And if they do not require design review for the uses we propose, that ends the inquiry under the well-established Court of Appeals case law on interpreting local provisions. So we believe these uses are permitted. We don't believe the design review for the Central City Business District apply. And in fact, if you wanted to go down the rabbit hole of whether or not something makes sense, if you read the Central City Business Standards, in multiple places, it specifically says this is to guide development in the downtown area. So what really doesn't make sense is that there's any reference to it in the Murphy Refinement Plan where there isn't a Central City Business District. Now, the fix that I suggest is not to allow staff to interject new substantive provisions that aren't in the code. The fix is for the city council to go back and fix this. Obviously, there was some language that wasn't appropriately used, and it's not for you to and staff to say, well, we're going to revise the code as we see fit on the go in a land use application. I think your job is to apply the text as written, and if the city council wants to amend this provision and make it more clear what it intended, it can do that going forward. The next big issue we agree are the roundabouts. And this is another one, it's kind of a similar analysis. And I have to say, I'm a little confused when staff in their report said dedication is required. Dedication is never required because staff has admitted they can't take it. They can't exact the dedication because the impacts of this proposal are not sufficient under the Fifth Amendment. So it's not going to be, there won't be a dedication of property. What staff, I think, is referring to is something it calls an assumed setback, which I think is probably the special setback. Now, if you read the plain text of the special setback for non-existing roads, the special setbacks require a right-of-way width be honored as provided for in the underlying zone. Now, the Murphy Refinement Plan doesn't have any right-of-way special setback for a roundabout. It has, if you look at 2.7830, very detailed street profiles and requirements for right-of-way. The widest right-of-way required that could ever be a special setback is the 80-foot right-of-way for the frontage street. Staff refers to a diagram that appears to show some circles. They're not labeled. There's no dimensions. There's nothing to tell a hearings officer what that diagram means. That's why it's important under the case law that the hearings officer apply the substantive standard in the code. And the substantive standard does not have a special setback for a roundabout. And staff took you down the path of the TSP. Well, if you read the TSP, the current TSP, and you look for these frontage street improvements up near Murphy and going down, it's project C48. And for project C48, if you click on it and try to figure out what the improvements will be required, it says not yet determined. So in the city's own TSP, it hasn't even determined what improvements it's going to want eventually in this corridor. So for all those reasons, we think the insistence on a roundabout and a special setback is directly inconsistent with the plain text of the code and the requirements of the code, and it cannot be imposed on this development. Now, we have shown in an exhibit we sent you, we have illustrated how a roundabout at Murphy and the not yet built frontage street could be designed and built without taking any right of way. Mr. Weishaupt drew that up and submitted it, and he can comment on it when I'm done. But we don't believe it applies. We don't believe there is a special setback. But what we wanted to show you is that roundabout could be accommodated without affecting any of the buildings in that area. And that's the big point, because staff is saying that these unknowns require us to move the buildings. That's not true. You now have a known that if the city ever decides to put that roundabout in, it can be done without impacting this development in that area. And that we illustrated that one for a reason. That's two larger streets, and well, we had our traffic engineer look at it, and we had to beef up traffic going forward 65% over what's there now. And with that number, the warrant for a roundabout still is not met. That intersection still meets all standards with an increase of 65%. The point of that is, that's why the improvements, I think, in the TSP are listed as undetermined. It is that roundabout, if it's built, it's going to be long out in the future, if ever. And it's not, the point is, it's not the applicant's responsibility to account for that, unless there's a specific special setback linked to the TSP that says there's a roundabout that's designed and going to go in that location, and there's not. Now, we didn't do that for B Street for a reason. The Murphy plan does not show does not describe a special setback for a roundabout at that location. And if you look at the map, that road is not going to go very far. It doesn't go to the east at all. We've got buildings there, and even the plan doesn't show that road going to the east. And to the west, it kind of goes to another local street, but then there's beyond that to the west, there's all houses. And so the Murphy plan to me reflects that the city's determined that they're not going to condemn that property and extend that street out. So we think that we haven't shown that because we can't imagine there ever being impacts, not even from us, but impacts in the future that would require a roundabout in that location. And since it's not described in the substance of the plan, we're not proposing that one at all. The improvements on Murphy Road, Scott Ferguson in his report detailed the numbers and the statistics and data that support a 73.5 foot turn lane. And I haven't, the staff wanted 100 feet, but we responded with information that 73.5 feet is all that's needed. And we're going to stand on Mr. Ferguson's testimony in his report. That's what's needed for a turn lane there, given the amount of traffic. And as to the cascade of improvements, Tim is going to talk about that a little bit more, but we didn't propose a 12-foot sidewalk for a reason. There's an existing 6-foot sidewalk. And we just proposed all along Murphy, and we just proposed to continue it because we're not generating any impacts that require a 12-foot sidewalk, and staff hasn't presented any. That would be an off-site public improvement that the city would have to satisfy the Nolan-Dolan essential nexus test. And we've been through that before with this hearings officer. They have to show some specific impacts that show that the legitimate interest would be substantially impeded. So how will our impacts substantially impede a 6-foot sidewalk to the point where a 12-foot sidewalk is needed? There's nothing in the record to support that. And so for many of the same reasons that you explained in the Boyd Acres matter 20.0 or 20-0569, they apply equally here. That sidewalk is not justified. The 6-foot sidewalk is plenty. And as far as how stormwater from that is going to be captured, Mr. Weishaupt will explain to you, while the existing swale could be expanded to accommodate this little bit of water, it takes a big basin. It's a big facility. And the improvements on Murphy that would go in there would be very, very minor. But he'll explain to you, we can accommodate that down on our site without ever touching that swale. And that's what the public permitting process is all about. And that's when the engineers get together and he designs the plans and he shows where that stormwater is going to go. He'll explain to you how feasible it is from an engineering standpoint to accommodate all of the runoff from the Murphy improvements, even if it were a 12-foot sidewalk, which we don't think it can be, but all of those improvements can be accommodated from a stormwater standpoint, as well as the local street improvements we propose. So that's not going to be an issue. We're going to take the swale out of play. On the improvements, this is one where this is also kind of similar to the issues we faced in the Boyd Acres development. It's kind of an interesting position. The city staff agrees that the impacts from this development are not sufficient for the city to exact right away for a collector street. Yet it somehow feels that because on a piece of paper, it's classified as a certain street, that changes everything. And the Constitution, particularly the Fifth Amendment, goes out the window, and they can make my client put the improvements for a collector street in right away that it agrees is sufficient without a collector road. Now, intuitively, obviously, that makes no sense. But more importantly, this very issue has been decided by the Court of Appeals in the Hill versus City of Portland case. It's kind of the flip side of that case. I've explained it in my letter, and I'm sure you'll read the case, but in that case, my client wanted to do a development, and the City of Portland came out and said, well, you don't generate impact sufficient to warrant improvements, but because in the future we may want to put them there, we want your right of way. Obviously, we said, no, you can't have it. And you haven't justified it. And their only justification was similar to the cities here, is that, well, we show that street as a certain classification. And streets of that classification have to have a certain width. And so because we have a street classification, it's in our code, we can't change it. You have to give us that right of way. Well, the Court of Appeals rejected that argument correctly under the Fifth Amendment. And they said, you cannot just rely on something that's written on a piece of paper to exact property. That may be a legitimate desire of the city. We're not questioning whether the city's ultimate vision for 50 years from now shows these connections to China Hat, et cetera. Those may be laudable goals and objectives, but they're general benefit issues. Those are public in the general sense that benefits from those. And the difference is the city's free to do that. They can make those improvements. They can use SDC charges. They can partner with private development to do all of what they want to do. But the important issue that the city has overlooked and not really addressed for you is there's limits based on the Constitution and the case law under the Constitution as far as how far the city can go to make a private development pay for that and give property for that. And that's the issue that Hill decided in favor of our position, is you can't rely on these general standards to say that's enough. You've got to show how the impacts will allow the city to acquire these improvements under Coons, which are the same as property, real property, or you can't take it. You have to find another way to do this. And so for the improvements, we believe that the Fifth Amendment and the case law under it does not allow the city to require us to show how we can build collector improvements when our impacts are not sufficient to justify a collector street. If they were, the city would be taking 80 feet. The next issue I want to talk about is the pedestrian path, and I'm going to kind of lump things. We've talked about this in two places. One, I have a separate section on connectivity, and then later we talk about access to site C and D, where that jog of the private drive is, as staff reported, because of the zone change. The first point we want to make about this is we don't believe there's any justification for the city to require a public facility there. So on site D for this RV park, what we've shown is internal drive aisles. And they're multi-purpose based on the use. It's going to be used for the RVs and whatever ancillary vehicles are there, plus bikes and pedestrians, and that was adequate for the inside of the park. And they with one modification, in the first round, staff noted that there are some existing pedestrian facilities and connections from the RV park out to them should be provided. And that made sense. And so in the northeast and southeast corner, on the modified plan, the applicant showed connections to Murphy Road sidewalk and out to this existing pedestrian pathway along Highway 97. And then we revised the northwest corner by building A to make it more direct access to the sidewalk there. So we felt we addressed all of these pedestrian connection issues. And then staff came back in the revised report and said, well, no, now you need a full pedestrian facility going out from the frontage road, basically out to Highway 97. And that's got to be public because we need connectivity. Well, the first thing I want to point out is, you know, the Murphy refinement plan that staff really rests on has its own street design. And you've seen it's in the code, and staff probably has it in its material that it uploaded. And that shows where the blocks are supposed to be under the plan. And even though those blocks may not be fully compliant, the city's position is, well, because we put them on our plan, that's fine. You don't have to meet connectivity for cars. Now, those streets all have sidewalks. And our position is when the city put that plan in place, it showed not only where connectivity and block length was adequate for cars, they were showing where block length and connectivity was required for all purposes. And if they wanted a separate pedestrian facility going out to Highway 97 through the property, it would have been reflected on the Murphy refinement plan. The second point of this is if they're going to exact a public facility over the property, the city has to go through the analysis. And as I just explained, the applicant and the proposal doesn't create the block length issue. That was created when the city drew up the street plan for the Murphy refinement plan. So the proposal doesn't create the block length problem, nor are we impeding any legitimate interest in block length because we've accommodated all of the pedestrian traffic in that area with our private connections. So I don't think the city can show what's required under Nolan and Dolan, primarily Nolan, to exact a public facility through our property. And the private facility is adequate and meets the code. Now, we have given you some exhibits as evidence to show how feasible it would be to condition this part of the application if you disagree with our Nolan analysis. And it's very simple. We can construct a pedestrian path that goes from the frontage street out to the path on Highway 97. It meets the code because we can keep it more than 5 feet from the private drive. And under section 3.1, 200, there's a couple other I's and A's there, but it's one of the multimodal provisions. It only has to be raised and curbed if it's closer than 5 feet to a street. And so our proposal was to move it more than 5 feet from the private drive, which means it doesn't have to be raised or curbed. And it could be within a public access easement. And what that accomplishes from our perspective is without the curb, there's no conflict with the manhole. So there's an existing sewer line, and it's a little complicated because the zone line is kind of jagged in that area. It doesn't follow the middle of the street. So as staff reported, to make sure we kept the road, the private drive, all the way on the commercial zone where it leaves the ME zone, the road had to kind of bend up to follow the zoning line. And that put the manhole not in the middle of the street, which is where you would typically expect a manhole to be. So if there was a raised curb next to the drive, the manhole might be a problem. But as I've said, with our revised design that's fully compliant with the code, that manhole is not going to conflict, and it can be engineered to be where it's at without any problems whatsoever. And Tim will talk about that a little bit, I think, when I turn this over to him. So now I'm going to move on to some site plan issues. And these are, I hope, a little more easy to deal with. Building A has a frontage type, and we use the storefront. And we showed for the storefront, 65% of that area of the building being transparent glass. And staff's response to that was that now the whole building front has to be 65% glass. And we read the definition of storefront in the code to be inconsistent with that interpretation by staff. We think the code elsewhere defines a storefront to be not the whole frontage of the building, but really a certain part of the building that is defined and nominated as a storefront. And so we think our first design is fully compliant and meets the definition of a storefront as the city has defined it. But here's another example where we've shown you in an exhibit how odd it would look to have a building like that, but it is feasible to design a building that has pretty much all glass on the front, and so you could condition that comment of staff consistent with that exhibit. I've talked about in my letter, the next thing is the access to site C and D. I do want to talk about one other issue. I explained how we can satisfy the pedestrian pathway if you disagree with us, and how we can accommodate the manhole if we have to put a pedestrian pathway in there. The other issue staff raised is in the original modified site plan, we showed the private drive following the ME property where it can serve both uses, and then transitioning to exclusively used being on the commercial zone for the RV park. But the drive, the access we showed to the site C, the RV storage, took a right turn after site C and then went down south through part of the park and then into the RV storage. Now, I don't read the staff report to say that there's any code-based reason to reject that, but staff did question whether users of Site C, the RV storage, would actually do that. Again, I don't think it's staff's position to question how somebody designs their access if it's code compliant, and so we don't think any changes to the modified plan are required. But we have given you an exhibit that shows a modified access that comes in at the east side of Site C, eliminating that maneuver through the RV park and up from the south. So it would be a direct turn off the private drive. We would keep that old primary access as a secondary fire access and think that's just a prudent thing to do. But that exhibit shows that it would be feasible if you believe staff's comment on how people may use the site raises a code-based issue, and you disagree that our site plan meets that code, whatever it may be, a condition requiring this access would be feasible and would meet all code provisions. There's a couple building issues that staff raised. So we did a combination. The Murphy plan has certain storefront types, and for the bigger storage RV buildings that are expressly permitted outright, we did a combination. Andy Harmon from Steel did a combination using various features from the allowed frontage types, put some reinforced corners and some forecourts with furniture and trees, and I don't perceive staff has a significant problem with the storefront on the long front of the buildings, but there are a couple of sides of those buildings that are really far removed from the street. One of them, I think, is almost 100 feet removed. And staff commented that the cohesive design elements may not be all present on those sides of the buildings. We think that's a real small issue, and Andy Harmon has submitted, along with my letter, examples of how those buildings could be, just redesigned a little bit to add back those cohesive features from the front, wrapping all the way around the sides. Probably not that visible from the street, but it can be done. And then another issue staff raised was that they didn't find that the building material we proposed was consistent with the Central Business District design standards. Now, this issue will only come up if you agree with staff's position that it can assume these design standards into the Murphy refinement plan. But if you agree with us that the plain reading of the code, the text requires you to find that the Central Business design standards are not applicable because we're not proposing uses for which they are required, then this goes away. But if you do disagree with us, Andy Harmon has shown as an example for building B, how stucco can be implemented instead of what we showed as kind of metal on the fronts of these buildings, more of an industrial look. So the stucco would be something that you would find in the Central City Business District. You might not find it on a storage building, but you'd find it there. And so building B is just an exemplar of what could be done on every building. So if you disagree with us, we've illustrated that all of the frontages for these storage buildings could be designed consistent with the exemplar on building B, which would implement a material that staff, we think, has acknowledged fits with the Central City Business District. Storm drainage, I'm not going to really talk about other than what I mentioned, is that, you know, it seems, and I think Tim will explain in his experience, most of the stormwater technical things are worked out when the decision is final. We know what improvements are going to be done, and the engineers start submitting plans. Then you'll know kind of how much impervious surface you have. You'll be able to calculate the runoff from the various storm years and all the stuff they do on their computers. And then you can design public stormwater improvements. And in his experience, that's how it works. If we're held to a little different standard and we have to do it now, Tim will explain to you how feasible it is to treat all of the stormwater, both. I think staff only raised an issue on the public improvements, but if you have any questions as to whether the on-site stormwater can be treated, that's all been figured out by Tim, and he's going to tell you how it works. What I want to talk more about are a couple other issues. Clear vision was an issue. Andy from Steel proposed benches and some landscaping in these forecourts. We think they're nice features to have. They meet the intent of the code as staff explained it to us. And staff's only issue was with the benches and the furniture, we didn't illustrate how they did not interfere with clear vision. So we've given you an exhibit that really clarifies that. In a condition consistent with that would be more than feasible to limit the furniture and the vegetation consistent with any clear vision standards. Trees, we don't have it today. We're going to probably ask for 7. In fact, we will be asking the record be kept open because of the new issues staff raised and the limited time we had to deal with it this week. We had some complications. But what Tim did in the first instance is he said he didn't show trees specifically preserved because he said we're going to preserve as many as we can based on the need for utilities and construction, which kind of makes sense because until you know where the utilities are going to be and all the physical improvements, it's hard to know whether you're going to be able to save a tree or not. But his indication was we're going to save as many as we can. Now staff changed its position. They didn't have a problem with it in the first staff report, but now there's a problem and we need to apparently illustrate every tree we think can be saved. It seems odd that we would do that now because it's likely to change and it's likely to require a modification and more time and fees when we get to the design and show the utilities, and we may be able to preserve more than we reflect now and maybe less, but the point is we'll never know until we get that all laid out. But we will be submitting a tree plan that shows, based on the information we have currently, which has to be limited because we don't have approvals upon which we can start our work for the utility permitting, what trees we're going to try to save. And you know, it's in the best interest of the applicant to save as many as possible for this use. You know, they want to create an aesthetically pleasing environment for the people that are going to be using the project they're developing. So we're going to do what we think staff is asking and show what we can based on the information today. Staff raised an issue about intersection angles. And I just want to explain what we did as a team. The engineers laid out this proposed streets on our proposal, our site plan, to match exactly how they're shown on the Murphy refinement drawing that staff has leaned on heavily today. And Tim will tell you when he testifies, he confirmed that the angles shown on the refinement plan are just not 90 degrees. They're close, but they're not. So we showed them as they're shown on the plan, and they're still all within the 80-degree threshold. But we felt that the code that requires us to be as close to 90 as practicable meant that we had to show them as close to 90 consistent with the drawing, and that's what we did. Now, again, it seems like kind of a meaningless exercise since they're so close to 90 and they are exactly as shown on the plan drawing. But I confirmed this morning with Tim that if necessary, if you agree with staff, those can easily be shifted a little bit to make them exactly 90 degrees, and it will not impact the building layouts or anything else whatsoever. So it can be done. It's feasible. Bike parking, we thought we had this handled. There were a couple issues. Some of the bike parking was deemed convenient to the sidewalk, but not necessarily convenient from inside the site. And then the staff questioned whether the design of the bike facility itself would be appropriate. So Andy from Steel has prepared a couple of exhibits to show you some beefed up parking. It'll address all of staff's concern. It won't be close to an entryway. It'll be convenient. There will be parking convenient from inside the site. There'll be parking convenient from the street. We think it probably goes over and above what the code requires, but we did it, and it could be conditioned according to that exhibit. The last issue I want to talk to you about is the proportionate share. And so staff is proposing a condition that at this point in time, before phase one develops, the applicant paid $276,854 towards an estimated $2 million cost of the roundabout at Murphy and the frontage road. I think it might be both. And they say that's required because the TSP reflects this. And then they do a formula where they say existing trips are something, and then your trips, and based on the existing, how your trips relate to the existing trips, that's how we get to $276,000. And we have a lot of concerns about this, and we're going to submit something during the open record period from Mr. Ferguson because the city doesn't define existing trips. And so they're expecting us to pay a percentage of these improvements. This is just one of the problems based upon the existing trips today, when, as I explained, that roundabout won't be warranted even when 65% increased traffic exists. So it could be, if it's built, it could be 20 or 30 years from now. And as I explained on the TSP, of project C48, it's not even defined as a roundabout. So by the time this is built, do we get credit for the existing trips then? Which would make sense. Because if we're paying for it based on the existing trips now, and the existing trips are exponentially increased later, warranting the roundabout, our percentage would come way down. And yet the city wants the money now. It's just not equitable to take the money now based on the current conditions when the events triggering the improvement aren't going to be for many, many years in the future. So that's a big issue we have with that. It's kind of like what staff said about our proposal. Their analysis of the proportionate share is so filled with uncertainties that we don't think it can be imposed. There's no way to determine whether that is actually proportionate. I'm going to look at Scott's email. I think I mentioned this, but what you'll see from Mr. Ferguson is he's extrapolated out excessive demands. He's gone well above and beyond any expected traffic increase for trips, numbers that Bend may never see. And he still can't get that intersection to fall below a standard that would require a roundabout. And so that's another reason the proportionate share is based upon a percentage of the final improvements. Mr. Ferguson's information is going to tell you there's no way to know what the final improvements are going to be. They're not defined in the TSP now, as I said, under C48. So that's another major problem with proportionate share. So on my letter, I added a section that I haven't done with you before, but it's kind of, I think in this case, really important because for two reasons. One, I put in here hearings officer action. I think ORS 197.522 plays a big role in this case because that statute directs that, as I interpret it, and I think as it's been interpreted, if you find, based on the evidence, that feasible conditions are possible to achieve compliance, you have to approve rather than deny. And what we've tried to do today and what we're going to continue to do is to show you that on every issue staff raised, except for a couple of those fundamental ones I talked about earlier, feasible conditions can be imposed, making compliance possible. That's what the Gold case in Deschutes County found. It's got to show compliance is possible. And we have and will continue to demonstrate that conditions achieving compliance with all of the relevant criteria, if you agree with us on a couple of the major ones, the special setback and the design standards that would prohibit our uses outright when they are allowed in the code. If you get past those in our favor, there are conditions that would meet every single criteria applicable to this application. And I know, there are some public comments, I got them last night, and people are talking again about the purpose, and some people feel that residential use would be better. I just want to note, we'll respond to this a little bit more in the open record period, but this Murphy Refinement Plan has specific properties set apart for residential uses. And so when you look at those general purpose statements and you look at the comprehensive plan, all good goals. Nobody ever on our team has said these are not good goals, but those are implemented through the specific zoning enactments. And the Murphy Refinement Plan is one of them. And the Murphy Refinement Plan designated certain sections of this property as residential. And by the way, I want to loop back a little bit. When we did our traffic study that you have, even though there's no development on that residential property, to show how justified our position was on the roundabouts and the street improvements, Scott Ferguson included that potential traffic in his numbers. And staff agreed, even with his numbers, beefed up numbers, the Fifth Amendment didn't allow the city to take these improvements or this dedication. So we went over and above to include that property because we do believe it's zoned for residential, and at some date in the future that will likely be developed as residential. But the point here is the development here proposes uses that are in the Murphy Refinement Plan designated as permitted uses on the zones where we propose them. So we believe that the application is fully compliant with the requirements and consistent with the comprehensive plan because the refinement plan that has the requirements we're meeting were enacted to implement those goals. And so as far as public comments, we believe none of those raise an issue that would be approvable or deny approvability. So we'll talk more about those, but I'll save the rest for rebuttal unless you have any questions of what we've presented so far.
Thank you, Mr. Kobach. I appreciate your thorough analysis going through the items in the letter and the issues that will be key to this decision. I don't have any questions at this time, but I may after rebuttal and after hearing from who's going to be testifying next is. I'm
going to have Tim, the engineer, testify on storm drainage and his issues. I don't, unless you have questions, I think I covered the design issues. I don't think we need Andy. And then Larry Kine, the applicant, is going to probably make a couple comments as well. And he'll, I think, unless he tells us differently, I think he will conclude the applicant's presentation. So with that, Tim, can you take over on storm drainage?
I sure can.
Good morning.
Oh, there we are.
Go ahead.
Good morning. The stormwater and the roundabout are kind of connected, so maybe I'll just start with what we presented on the on the roundabout there, what we looked at the other day and submitted in the record was taking a 120 foot and a 160 foot radius and applying it to the intersection of Murphy and the frontage road. And what we found was with those radiuses and those diameters, there's sufficient right-of-way existing in that corridor section. The north line that's not shown on the plan is a common area. So it would likely be possible that you could increase that radius. The city's exhibit had a 100 foot radius or 200 foot circle. I'm not sure where the basis of that design parameter was, but we believe it's still feasible to fit a roundabout in the existing right of way. We also submitted an exhibit around the storm drainage system that exists now. Presently, that swale serves an area from Brookswood Boulevard all the way to the Parkway. So the drainage basin and the drainage analysis that the city was asking for in the conditions of approval and the recommendation, you'd have to consider that the size of that basin compared to the widening we're proposing and the short section of frontage road that would contribute more stormwater to this system could easily be accommodated in several methods. The existing storm swale has additional right-of-way to the east. So even if you were to put a roundabout in this location, you could still enlarge that existing stormwater swale to the east. And after completing a total basin analysis, I would imagine that you'd be able to provide sufficient capacity in that existing area. And again, as Chris said, we have additional area to the west, just west of the subject property. That's the applicant also owns, that we could even put some of the storage over there. But until we figure out, what the final design is here, it's pretty hard to do a basin analysis. Again, if staff's position is that there's gonna be a large roundabout there, what are they gonna do with stormwater when they build that roundabout? Point being, there's plenty of options, and we engineer those when we have those numbers and the facts to base that design on. Again, what we proposed here and what we're assuming was fairly negligible amount of additional runoff from widening and a portion of the frontage road. Our assertion is that we can engineer a solution that takes into account the wellhead protection area, because as Sarah had the exhibit up earlier that showed that stormwater protection area relating to the wells to the north, it traverses across this subject property in the north and the west corner. So our contributory area as proposed is fairly insignificant in relationship to the amount of basin that this stormwater facility, the existing stormwater swale, already services. So we believe that's completely feasible to take care of that stormwater. And again, the on-site and the rest of the remaining portion of the site, we have proposed drainage wells and a combination of dry wells outside of that wellhead protection area that we believe we have the stormwater issue completely covered there. I guess while we're on roads, we can talk about the angles, and I think Chris summed it up pretty well already and addressed those. We tried to replicate the existing plan as it was presented in the Murphy plan. Those intersection angles are within the specifications of the city of Bend, and of course that's our assumption, is that's why they're in the plan that way, is because that's the way they're depicted and they meet the specs. Again, those could be slightly altered and get closer to or right at 90 degrees should they need to be for some reason other than the existing specifications that they meet. So I wanted to touch on that and confirm those numbers. Let's hit on the trees real quick, I guess. Those are so difficult to figure out where all the utilities are going to lie. Our approach lately, and again, we take a different approach every time to try and satisfy and meet the code and get the intent in there of saving all the trees we can, because realistically, like Chris mentioned, like the applicant has mentioned, it's important. Those are assets, really, but to provide a finite design for a subdivision or a site plan to the degree that you can say that I'm going to save that tree is not realistic. So we've taken the approach that we've put circles around the tree protection, circles around on the plan where we see trees that, boy, we'd like to save that one. I'm pretty sure we can. So we put the circle around it. Those that land in buildings and roads and where it's a goner or there's a reason, some other reason that we know it's coming down, we put X's on it. Now, in this case, we left quite a few unmarked. And in the legend, it depicts that those are trees that, boy, we'd sure like to try and save. But we're also well aware that we have utilities to install. We have earthwork to do. The section we looked at this morning in detail in the office here was the northeast corner. There's a rock pile there, an existing native rock pile. If you have to blast through that, you don't know how far the ripples of blasting through that rock pile are going to carry. We don't have any way to predict with any real certainty that we might damage a tree that we have a circle around. So we're very hesitant to just save all the trees, because we know that leads to trouble down the road when you're in construction or you're finalizing a site plan. That's where roads water has to go. It has to go there. We know we're blowing up that rock pile, and the guys got happy with the dynamite and that tree fell down. Why? Well, because we couldn't see its root system. We didn't know where it was. So that's the approach we're trying to take. And like Chris said, we've kind of taken closer looks, and we can drill down it further and submit maybe a more finite or second version of what we think we can save and drill down a little harder on that. But holistically, that's the approach we're trying to take. And again, and to say with any certainty you can save any particular specimen is iffy at this stage, because we also don't inventory the health. We didn't send an arborist out there to assess 2,000 trees. So if you have bugs, you have root damage, again, a lot of factors there. So that was our approach to the trees. Which the next subject, let's talk about the ped path and the manhole conflict, which might have a bit of an effect on trees too. The manhole conflict with the roadway and sidewalk, that is a non-issue. I mean, we have so many different methods of spinning a manhole lid, putting a centric on it, moving the road over a bit, putting a concrete pad around it, sliding the path over. So I'm not really worried about the manhole. And we've prepared a couple new exhibits and put them in the record where we should. The concern of having a 6-inch curb over a manhole is not an insurmountable engineering feat whatsoever. We can move the path. We showed a couple of different driveway options. We feel that surrounds that entire conflict and that issue, at least from the engineering perspective, is that we can overcome the obstacles that were presented from staff's point of view on that subject. I think that wraps it up, and certainly open for questions now or in the near future.
Thank you, Mr. Weishaupt. I don't have any questions at this time. So who next for the applicant? Is there anyone else at this time that's going to be testifying for the applicant?
Well, this is Mr. Kovac. I know better than to try to cut Larry off, so I'm going to open it up to Larry if he has anything to say. If not, he'll let us know.
Okay.
Stephanie, good to see you.
Hi, Mr. Kine.
Beautiful flowers back there.
Thank you.
Juan, is there a way that we can share my screen?
Yes, Larry, you should be able to just click on share screen right now.
Okay, bingo, there it is. All right, let me see if that will work, Stephanie. That'll help so we all know what we're talking about. I think it is now being shared. Can you see that?
Not yet, Larry. There's one more step. So after you select the screen that you want to share, then you need to click share on the bottom right hand. There you go. It's coming through.
Awesome.
It's starting
Okay.
to come through. Yeah.
Fantastic. So Stephanie, what I wanted to do real quickly is go show you this roundabout. And, you know, the reason I instructed the team not to go design a roundabout is I was a little concerned that if we designed a full roundabout, they would just kind of nitpick it apart, or they would conceive that, you know, I am offering up a roundabout, and I just didn't really want that confusion to ever take place. So just a little bit of background is I've sent several emails out to Colin and to staff offering a fig leaf of, hey, let's go build whatever you guys want to go build. And we'll put in the roundabout, we'll put in all the improvements, we'll do whatever you want. Let's work out an arrangement. You have many tools to be able to help participate in getting the infrastructure that you want. You've got SDC reimbursements. You've got the Murphy Urban Renewal District, where it has funds in there that are slated for improvements, traffic improvements to the area. None of those ever got any response, zero, nothing. And so the city doesn't really have an interest in doing this unless someone else pays for it. So that's kind of the background that we have. The exhibit that we have up here is the roundabout on Reed Market and Wood River Drive. Now, I understand this roundabout very well because it's right in front of my house. And so this is a 3-legged roundabout, just like what would be needed at Murphy and the new frontage road. And we superimposed it on there. So if you start on the very, very top of this, you're going to see up here, can you see my cursor moving?
Yeah, I do. Thank you.
Okay.
Chris.
So that's the edge of private property. The next dotted line down is what Tim referred to as the area of common area. That's what's in between there. And then we come into what is the city's current right of way. And so you'll see that this roundabout can go fit right inside of their existing roundabout. If you come over here to this area where my cursor is now, that's the edge of the fence for the drainage. So we wouldn't be touching the drainage whatsoever, or that could actually get, let me go into the drainage in a minute. I have another one that'll be better served for that. If you come down to the bottom here, this is our existing, I know my thing's popping up, our existing development with our buildings and everything. And this circle that goes around here is an 80-foot radius, 160-foot diameter. And it would fit right in there with all of the improvements that we currently have without a problem. So it's a busy one because we just kind of superimposed on there. So I thought it might be helpful to kind of walk your way through it. When I first looked at it, I'm like, holy crap, what's what? The rest of this road is the existing Murphy Road is what you'll see in that. If we go to the next item, did that pop up where you're seeing a new screen?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, okay, great. This is the Murphy Road, and this is that drainage system. As you can see, it goes all the way out to Brookswood. So all of this purple that comes down over here and comes over to where it says Murphy Road here, that's that drainage basin that is getting utilized, that's on the north side of Murphy Road. And if you see this little jab right here, that's where it goes and gets injected into the big swell that's over there on the north side. Up in this area of our project, we've got a storm drainage that we're going to go ahead and plan on putting in. It would be, so first of all, let me back up in here. You can see this is ginormous. And we're talking about adding 73.5 feet by 13 feet wide. Compared to all of this, that is nothing in comparison. So in the event that we needed to, we have lots of different options. One is if you come over here and you see this, there's the basin right there, and that stub into it's about right here. There's lots of room here, and there's room on the other side to expand that if needed. If that didn't work, we could go over there and take this catch basin and put it into our storm drainage over here. That's just what we do every single time when we're doing design work once we have a land use approval. I've never, ever had to go and show storm drainage on a tentative plat approval or tentative site plan. I don't understand. Lastly, the trees. We owned an RV park and sold it. It was Crown Villa RV Park. The biggest part of the attraction to that RV park was all of the trees that were in that RV park. It's one of the top 50 RV parks in the entire country. And this RV park, I want it to be very similar to that. We want as many trees as possible. These people are campers. They're trying to enjoy the great outdoors. We're certainly not going to go and clear cut this. We're going to go and save as many trees as we possibly can, given that we have to go put in, power and sewer and water and irrigation systems to all this area to be kept, beautified. And so we'll be very, very, very mindful of that. But it's just like Tim said, if we go and we put a circle around a tree, that now all of a sudden something happens because, the tree's diseased or any number of reasons, it's like an act of God to go back through the city and get it approved to be able to have that one tree taken down. And so it really handcuffs you in the design and slows it down. When this project gets approved and gets built, the economic impact to the city is tremendous. I mean, we had 106 sites at Crown Villa RV Park and brought in 22,000 people a year. On this site here, we're going to have 176. It's going to bring in 35,000 people a year to the Bend area to go and buy fuel and go out to dinner and to pay transient tax at 11% to the city of Bend. In the wintertime, what happens is you don't have as many RV park, people transients driving up and down, and it becomes affordable housing through the winter months. This is a project that is drastically needed for the economic viability of the area. It's so underserved by RV and commuters that want to go travel, especially given with the COVID response that's happened in the last year, where people don't want to go get in a motel or anything like that, or go out to eat. They want to be in their own private space. And so it would just absolutely be criminal to take the city's position, ever-changing position, I might add, because every single time I've talked to them about this project, I've gotten a different answer on what is needed and what is, the problems, from the pre-app to the incomplete letter on the first one, and the second incomplete letter, and the first hearing officers, recommendations to the second modifications. Every one has been different. And so I understand this has been a project that had zoning on it in 2006 and has never been touched. And the main reason is it's kind of poor planning by the city. Now, we've finally figured out something that I think that fits in there, that's permitted outright or conditionally. And I think it's going to be a great project. It's going to be a great aspect to people coming in off of South Highway 87. And it's going to be a huge economic impact to the city of Bend, both publicly and privately, through taxes and economic stimulus from the vacationers that are coming in on it. So if you have any questions of us, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Mr. Kine. I appreciate your screen shares and a little bit more detail on some of those issues. Okay, Mr. Kobach, is there anyone else that's going to be providing testimony at this time for the applicant?
Not this morning, Hearings Officer Marshall. We will formally request that to the extent, so I don't forget during rebuttal, that the record be kept open under ORS 1977763.
Okay. All right. Okay, so now we will turn to public testimony. We'll start with anyone that wishes to testify in support of the application at this time.
Hearings Officer Marshall, we have Ken Atwell, who has raised his hand, so I'm going to unmute him. Ken, I'm going to unmute you.
Thank you.
Ken, you should be able to speak.
My name is Ken Atwell. I represent the Southeast Bend Neighborhood Association. My address is 20464 Powder Mountain Court. My concern starts with the very notion of any kind of legal and legislative issue. And contrary to Mr. Kobach's assertion, when stumbling over what is actually meant by the details, might be well advised to go back to the initial findings and purpose. And both the planner and the applicant keep turning to the Murphy Crossing Plan, which has its own findings and purpose. And then they jump to the Bend Development Code to find this conditional use. They started with a type 2 application. The Murphy Crossing Plan was a legislative amendment to the comprehensive plan. If they want to undo or pick apart the Murphy plan, then they might be well advised to go back and just completely undo it and go back to RS zone. Otherwise, the proper authority is the Murphy Crossing Plan. The Murphy Crossing Plan is an amendment to the comprehensive plan. It is an amendment under the notion of area planning. And the very notion of area planning is that it is there to provide special zoning for special purposes. And the area planning tools allowed them to also integrate a development agreement with the other taxing bodies for an urban renewal area. This urban renewal area is a development agreement without a development application. Code says a development agreement without a development application, the code, business development, or the development code does not apply. They are creating their own. Their code gives some definition to commercial general. They had to be perfectly aware of the conditional uses and all the other 32 uses that the city identified in its development code for commercial general. There is no reference in the Murphy crossing plan for any conditional uses. There's no reference for uses that would not qualify under their notions of commercial, retail. There are countless of the 32 uses that would not apply. So we've now got a development agreement without a development application that is its own code. It does not contain a conditional use. It has a purpose. It has a purpose to produce the needed increase assessed valuation to pay for the improvements suggested. The improvements suggested are part of and continue to be part of the Transportation System Plan. Transportation System Plan under Oregon Administrative Rule 660.12.45 said that the city will implement land use plans that demonstrate the dedications needed to fulfill their plan, their transportation system plan. It does not say that it has to be within the next 5 years, the next 10 years. We have waited close to 20 years to get the on-ramps and off-ramps at Murphy. The urban renewal plan has cost other taxing entities money over the years in the anticipation of fulfillment of that plan. To throw it out at this point is a serious error in going forward with any serious planning efforts on the part of the city. So I think this started with the lack of priority on the part of the city, lack of attention to this plan, which then led it to be a type 2 rather than it should have started out as a legislative amendment, gone to the Planning Commission, gotten a much wider public input. It might have even gotten my input then, but somehow the planner could not find a way to measure from the edge of the property as dictated by code, but measured from the center of the property and never gave us notice. So I believe if you're going to refer to the Murphy plan, stick to the Murphy plan. There was a purpose behind it, as much as is suggested that purpose is irrelevant to general. There was a purpose, and to totally disregard it is to totally disregard the whole notion of public participation in plans. You know, there were a lot of people who were involved in this Murphy Crossing plan that never received notice. So I think the whole process to this date has followed the wrong path. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Atwell. Okay. Who
I
is
don't
next?
see any other hands raised, and I just want to mention for the caller on area code 714 that if you do want to raise your hand to speak, you would use the *9 key. Karen Johnson would like to speak. I'm going to let her speak. Karen,
Okay.
you should be able to speak.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can, Ms. Johnson.
Good. Thank you. I'm the land use chair for the Old Farm District Neighborhood Association. I've read the various documents in this case, but I have not seen an answer to my fundamental question. Part of this development is zoned ME, and that's mixed employment. And when I read the definition of that, the mixed employment zone is intended to provide a broad mix of uses that offer a variety of employment opportunities. Where mixed employment districts occur on the edge of the city, their function is more transitional in nature, providing service, commercial businesses, and supporting residential units in an aesthetic mixed environment. You look at the Bend Comprehensive Code, it talks about designing several small commercial centers throughout the community to offer convenient shopping and services. Chapter 6 talks about providing this specific zone, providing areas that exhibit a pattern of mixed development or new areas that provide transition between employment and residential uses. What I have not seen in any of these documents is an analysis of whether this project will provide the sort of employment opportunities that the code requires. I don't know much about RV parks, I have to admit, but from what I've seen of this plan, you're going to have someone administering the 168 slot RV park, and that can't be very many people. You have someone managing the storage units. I know something about storage units, and typically you have 1 or 2 people in the office managing the units. So how does this project serve the long-term goal of the city in terms of offering a variety of employment opportunities? I know that the Stillwater development, I think 240 apartment units, is going in, I think within like a third of a mile south of this area. You have people who, because it's a lower income, who don't have cars. To me, this area would be ideal for a grocery store, for commercial, for retail, so that people can walk to it. And when you look at, again, at the Bend Comprehensive Plan, you look at Chapter 6, particularly 6-24, the mixed use development. The point of this is to foster pedestrian and other non-motor vehicle access within and to the site. I don't see how this project, that is to say, the nature of this project, fits with what the zone is intended to do. I've seen no analysis of how many people it will employ and whether it could be better used for some other sort of a commercial endeavor. So that seems to be a fundamental analysis that I have not seen, that I think is important if you're going to follow the code and the requirements for this mixed employment district. In terms of the RV park itself, I have to take issue with the testimony that it's going to provide for low-income housing. My understanding of an RV park is that RVs are driven by tourists. They come here, they park, they visit sorry, the dogs just saw something. I'm very sorry. They drive home in their RV vehicle. How in the world is an RV park going to contribute to the problem with affordable housing in Bend? I can't see that it does. But I think my basic question is, shouldn't there be an analysis of how many people are going to be employed on these two lots and whether that meets the zone as it's defined? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. All right, is there anyone else that wishes to testify this morning?
Hearings Officer Marshall, I don't see anyone else indicating they would like to provide testimony.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Pyatt. All right. Okay, so at this time, I would turn the hearing back over to staff for response to obviously the applicant's testimony and any issues raised by the public that they wish to comment on. And following staff presentation, would turn it back to the applicant for final rebuttal. And then we're going to talk about the request to leave the record open at the conclusion before we end the hearings this morning. So Ms. Anselman?
Thank you again. I'll just cover a few things, and if Chris Henningston is still available, he might weigh on some of the infrastructure. That's more his area of expertise. I wanted to touch briefly on the tree removal plan. It was noted in the first staff report that it was unclear which trees were going to be preserved or removed. I've reviewed many land use decisions and have seen many what we call tree preservation plan, either indicating removal or preservation, either way, with a high degree of accuracy. I understand it is tedious work, but it is work that does need to be done up front. I see it on a consistent basis because it's the only way we're able to make findings addressing the standards regarding tree preservation. I wanted to also mention the block length and perimeter standards, block length and perimeter standards. The Murphy Crossing Refinement Plan lays out the streets. It does not lay out pedestrian routes. It's not a requirement that pedestrian routes are predetermined. By not determining pedestrian routes, there is the opportunity for flexibility. The code states that exceptions can be granted if there is an area plan, and in this case, an exception is listed in the recommendation to grant an exception to the block length and perimeter standards for streets because the street layout is predetermined, but that the area plan does not include a layout for pedestrian paths, hence the recommendation to include one east-west between the frontage road and the existing ODOT facility. And the reason that that is public is because it brings the block length and perimeter into compliance for pedestrian traffic, folks on foot, skateboard, without having to go, basically the long way around. It gives them reasonable distances to get from point A to point B, in this case, to use the existing pedestrian path along the highway there. The architectural design standards, the Murphy Crossing code text points to two subsections to use for the architectural design. There is a section of code for multifamily and the other section is for commercial. And I explained that in the recommendation, why we went with the commercial standards. It's fairly obvious this isn't a multifamily project. It's not in a multifamily district. It's not even proposing a mixed use that includes multifamily. Therefore, those standards were not appropriate. Also point out that the 12-foot sidewalk on Murphy Crossing that is mentioned, I think it's conditioned in the recommendation, that 12-foot sidewalk abutting the site is called for on the special street standard for Murphy Road. Regarding the building storefront, that's one of the frontage types listed in the Murphy Crossing refinement plan. The applicant's definition of storefront would just allow them to define whatever area they want to be the storefront to meet the standard to be used, which really defeats the purpose of having a storefront. If you can just say, well, only this is our storefront, whether you're setting it in, defining it with other architectural elements. We examined what it means to be a storefront, me and other staff, and determined that a storefront is the entire wall when it is applied to the standard requiring 65% windows. If Chris Henningsen is available, I want to turn it over to him if he's available. I'm not sure, to comment on any of the infrastructure if he's got anything.
Yeah, I'm here.
Chris.
Couple things in conversation from Mr. Weisup. He indicated that he had submitted a roundabout design, conceptual roundabout design, or at least a layout of what one would look like with this site plan. No such roundabout was ever submitted to record. A matter of fact, during this meeting was the first time that we've ever seen such document. One of the issues that we have, and this goes back to the widening of Murphy, was that no grades or no survey were provided on the north side of Murphy that would indicate how those improvements were going to impact that swale. As part of the submittal requirements under 4.2.300 of the development code, submittal requirements for any site plan review, subdivision or otherwise, needs to clearly show existing topography. It needs to show how stormwater is going to be mitigated, even in a conceptual manner. None of that information has been provided on the plans that would clearly identify how the stormwater or the impacts to the existing grades in the area were going to be impacted through the development. So for that reason, I go back to what Sarah said. We cannot make a decision because the information has not been provided to us to make that decision. With the response to the right angles of intersections, as Sarah indicated very clearly at the beginning of this meeting, the master plan allows for the moving of streets within, I believe she said 30 feet plus or minus of the master plan. That is what probably needed to be done with the intersections. So the intersections by our code it's written that way, especially for the elderly. They have difficulties turning their neck. They have difficulties being able to maneuver intersections that come in an askew. The code says that they shall be provided at a 90-degree angle unless otherwise indicated because of topography constraints. None of that has been shown or illustrated on this plan that indicate a reasoning as to why that code cannot be met. I think that's all I have at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. All right. No other staff person I see on here. All right, I will turn it back to the applicant for rebuttal, and then we can discuss open record periods. Mr. Kobach.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Thank you. I'll start with staff. That's I think that can be gone over pretty quickly. I'll let Tim confirm this, but I think when he mentioned this morning the conceptual roundabout, he was referring to what he submitted this morning. So I think that just clarifies that. And I'll let him talk about the existing topography and the grades. I'm not sure if the comment that we didn't show grades or surveys for the roundabout or was related just to the roundabout. The reason we wouldn't have showed that is we didn't propose the roundabout, and our position remains that we won't build it. And I think staff concurs that the development can't be required to build it. So when it's built, I think Tim and Larry both explained this morning, there's room for the city to design and build the roundabout it desires. And there's apparently renewal money that it can use if it wants to do that. I would note that there were comments about renewal money. The application does not ask for any of it. There's no, we're not trying to take advantage of getting free money. Everything proposed here is private money. So there should be, to the extent there's renewal money, we're not tapping into it. So it should be there for these general public benefits that the city may want in 10, 20, 30 years. I don't read the right angle code provision exactly the way the staff reads it. The hearings officer has read many code provisions, and I'm sure has read the law that I cited earlier on how to interpret it, but I read it to say they must be as near as practicable to right angles, then except where topography requires a lesser angle. I read that to say they must be as near as practicable to right angles, and then if topography requires them to be less than 80 degrees, they can be 80 degrees, but the topography isn't linked to the practicality part in the first sentence. And I don't know why, staff is saying, well, our diagram shows generally roundabouts, and that's the Bible, we've got to stick to it, but it shows streets at not right angles. You can move those. So it's another position where I think staff's kind of going back and forth and cherry picking from various sources, what it wants to use and what it doesn't want to use, depending on how it can recommend a denial. And we just don't think that's a fair way to apply the code. The design standards, it's mainly in our written material, but you cannot say that as required allows you to pick between 2.1900 and 2.2800. That text, if you're going to apply it as written, you either have to apply it the way we articulate it, or you have to say for every development in the Murphy refinement plan, both of those provisions apply and must be adhered to, because it says as required by 2.1900 and 2.2800. The way staff read it to you, the way they interpret it to you is they can pick and they can say 2.190 or 2.2800 apply depending on how we want to apply it. That is not what the law allows them to do. We will stick to our definition of storefront. It's in the city's code. This is another example where for purposes of the refinement plan, the city is saying, we're going to define storefront the way we want to, not the way our code defines it. We're going to define it as the full building length because we've had some private conversations, and that's how we think it best be applied in this refinement plan. The code has a definition of storefront that's not consistent with that. We showed a storefront with a big entrance. That's what a storefront is. That met the 65% glass. Now staff wants to say you have to have the entire frontage all glass. Shouldn't be an issue, but if it is, we can do that. The Murphy sidewalk, all I'm going to say is that is exactly a Hill issue. It just because it's on a plan doesn't mean the city can do it. And they can use their renewal money, or they can do it with a partnership, or they can do it on their own. The point is to make somebody else pay for it under Hill, you need to satisfy the Nolan test. And they didn't give you any explanation today of impacts. In fact, I specifically pointed out that the impact analysis was required for all of the street improvements that they claim we need to show in this 60 feet. And there was not one mention of impacts. The only evidence you have from impacts in the record from staff thus far are statements saying this proposal will not produce impacts that justify a collector street. That's the extent of the impact analysis. It's the same thing with block length. I do think it's a little disingenuous to say, well, Murphy plan shows just the streets, but it doesn't show pedestrian connections, so we can put them wherever we want. I think what's lost in that is the street classifications that the city relies so heavily upon elsewhere specifically require sidewalks. That's where the 12-foot sidewalk on Murphy comes from. It's because that classification requires it. To suggest that by showing the streets does not reflect the intent to show where the pedestrian connections are, when their standards staff relies on incorporate sidewalks specifically, we don't think that's genuine. Though that's where the pedestrian connections, the public connections, were deemed reasonable and appropriate under the Murphy plan. The public comments, I don't know why Mr. Antwell didn't get notice. We complied with every email and every notice requirement that we received from staff. We believe the notice was 100% consistent with code. We had a pre-application conference and we applied for the type of application that the city staff told us was appropriate for these applications. And so I can't imagine there's any problem with process that the applicant didn't follow. The only other thing I want to point out is I think it may have been difficult to discern from the Murphy plan, but the way it's written, and staff agrees with this on pages 8 and 9 of the staff report, is all of the uses that are allowed in the underlying ME and the CG zone are permitted in the refinement plan unless the refinement plan says otherwise. And the refinement plan, as staff has supported us on, doesn't disallow RV parks as a conditional use. So in other words, all of the conditional uses in the CG zone generally apply in the refinement plan because that's the way the refinement plan was written. And the same for the ME property. So my concluding comment will be to the employment, and I get it. There's these statements in all zones about, well, this is kind of how we envision this zone, general commercial, residential, they all have these general purpose statements, but those zones apply throughout the city to large pieces of property all over. And there's nothing inconsistent with saying we want ME property to provide opportunities for employment and pedestrians, et cetera. That doesn't mean that every development on every ME property must have a certain quota of employment or a certain quota of pedestrian-oriented development. How it's implemented is through the zoning code and the Murphy refinement plan. So it talks about the general purposes and the goals, but then it goes further to say, but these are the uses we expressly allow in those zones. And as an applicant, you're allowed to propose uses that are outright permitted within that zone, consistent with the general purpose statements. You're not required, as I said, to propose a specific mixed use with a specific number of employment opportunities for every use on your property. You're allowed to develop consistent with what the code states is a permitted use. And on that more global issue, I think staff's treatment of this has been consistent with ours. These are allowed uses. The only point we deviate in this issue is on that application of that one design criteria, where staff seems to now suggest that it can make these uses not permitted because they're not pedestrian oriented. But I think our analysis is solid on that. And other than that, though, I think staff and the applicant are pretty much on the same line as far as are allowed the allowed uses and what we can propose. So I want Tim to talk a little bit about the last comments on what needs to be submitted for storm drain. Maybe he can reinforce how our plan was sufficient to establish feasibility of compliance.
Sure can. First, I'm really disappointed that nobody told me I could share my screen now. That makes it a lot easier for engineers to talk, because unless we have a pencil in our hand and a piece of paper in front of us, we don't know what to say. Anyhow, can I share my screen?
You sure can.
Oh, fantastic. that helps a bunch. Yeah, just first real quickly on the tree plan. This is one of the sheets submitted. I didn't upload them, so I don't know if they got renamed, but this is part of our tree submittal and grading plan. You can see a few things on there. Some trees with circles, some trees with X's, some unmarked. Let me see if we can find an unmarked one. There we go. And of course, you know, in the legend, it's pretty clear the effort's being made here, and I don't know what's not real clear about it, except for the fact that there might be too many X's, there might be not enough circles, there may be too many left blank to provide the comfort level, but we think it's fairly clear. We do have existing contours in the background here and proposed new contours in general. Here's the rock pile I was talking about this morning. You can see the contour relief there, and the fact that, you know, if you're going to put dry vial across there, you're probably going to need to do some blasting and grading. You might be able to bring the road up, but again, this isn't design level detail provided at this juncture. You'll also notice up here on the Murphy Road, there are also existing contours. The existing sidewalk, our proposed widening up here is shown on the site plan. So if you look at the existing contours and the fact that we're just moving the curb line from there to there, you can see from the contours existing, and we're not proposing to change the grade of the street. Again, this is a simple widening, move the curb out a bit. There's no major grading proposed. You can see the fence line type along the drainage facility. Let's see if we want to go to the next side here. There you go. Continuing on, yeah, you can see the fence for the drainage facility. You can see the driveway. And again, just a widening is all that was proposed there. And again, to clarify the roundabout submittal, yes, that was the exhibit that Larry showed me up on because he could share his screen. So that is the referenced roundabout so that we submitted. There was not one in the original submittal. I can touch on the block length too. I was looking at that, what was in the recommendation and the function of that requested public access across the site. If you take a look at directions of travel, where folks are trying to go, or what staff is saying is going to shorten the block length or make it in compliance. Well, first, the number that's shown in that modification or in the recommendation and the exhibit in the recommendation, it doesn't make the block length comply. It's still too long on the perimeter. But, you know, if you look at point A to point B, any way you slice it, it doesn't reduce the direction or the length of travel or direction or convenience. And, you know, when you look at it, it doesn't meet the code, and the code says may, it's not say shall provide a pedestrian access. So there's no destination on the parkway. Yeah, I figured that was worth mentioning and considering because it really doesn't function realistically at all in the real world. Trees block. I think that covers it unless you had any more questions, Stephanie.
Thank you, Tim. No, I don't at this point. Mr. Kine, did you have anything further you wanted to say before we talk about leaving the record open?
No, I stole Tim's thunder, and then Tim stole my thunder about the sidewalk going through the middle of the project goes to nowhere, it just goes to the highway. And so we put that through, we might be saving somebody's life that they don't want to go over there and jump in front of a car. So I say we shouldn't do it. Hey, those are
Okay.
nice flowers, by the way.
Thank you. Mother's Day.
Mhm.
All right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you everybody for your testimony today. I wanted to go over the leaving the record open, and before I do that, I'm going to actually read the summary. I think Sarah did a good job on page 4 of the revised recommendation. Item number 6 on that talks about the application acceptance date. I'm going to skim past some of the earlier stuff. There was a modification of application on January 7, and a hearing on the modified application took place on March 16, 2021. I mentioned that at the outset of this hearing today. At the hearing, the applicant requested continuation so they could submit another modification of application to the site plan and design review and to the conditional use permit applications. That was submitted on the 30th of March, and there's a 120-day review period which ends on August 4th. What we've not discussed today is a variance application that was also placed on hold on March 16, 2021. And as of the date of the staff recommendation, the hold is still active and there was not an end date that was provided. I'm going to actually turn it back real quick to the applicant on the interplay between the holds that have been placed before we talk about the holds that will be placed on the 120-day period, assuming, of course, that the applicant is willing to stay those periods while the record is left open. Mr. Kobach.
Thank you. Unless Larry sees it differently, our intent was to link all 3 applications to the same end date. And what we thought was that if we did that, August would be sufficient. But if for some reason you feel it's not, then we need to have a conversation. But as I think the staff report today and the written staff report indicates, that really the site plan modification drives everything. The recommendation is, if that's approved, the others should be approved. So we thought we'd all end on the same date. And if that needs to be made more clear than stating it on the record, just let us know what we need to do.
Okay, no, thanks. I just wanted to make sure that there was a statement in the record on this, just to, because there's a lot of moving parts here.
Yeah, we appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah, great. All right, so I am hearing obviously a request to leave the record open. And typically how this works is it's a 777. So the first 7 days is for submission by anyone of new evidence, testimony, written materials, exhibits in response to anything you've heard today, or the staff report, or anything that you want to bring to my attention. Again, the raise it or waive it standard that I mentioned at the beginning. I'm going to take a look at my calendar here to look at the 7 days. So that first open record, which is, for lack of a better term, a free-for-all, would end on Tuesday, May 18. I'm going to have Sarah address exactly what time the city would like those materials in hand and how they would like them in hand via either email or hard documents, depending on size. So I'm going to have Sarah address that after I go over the 777. So May 18, most likely 5 p.m., Sarah, defer to you, is the first round. The second round is Tuesday, May 25th. That's rebuttal only. This is your chance to respond to things that were submitted by any person during the first 7-day period. And then the final 7 ends on Tuesday, June 1st, and this is for the applicant only. The applicant only has the opportunity to submit final written argument by that date. Sarah, would you please address how the city would like materials submitted, timing, preference on email, hand delivery, and all of that, please?
Yes, thank you. Email is definitely preferred, especially because City Hall has limited access If it is not something that can be emailed, or if email is just not available, there is staff at City Hall that can accept something and they will get it to me. But I would suggest getting it there early because there is very limited staff that's actually in the building. If possible, I understand sometimes it takes time to put materials together. And if you do drop it off at City Hall, make sure that the staff that takes it knows exactly what application it's for, so that they have my name and the file numbers, or at least one of them, so that they can get it to me as quickly as possible. I'd also advise letting them know that it's time sensitive, because they don't know all the ins and outs of planning. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. My email and phone number is on the notice that went out. And I think City Hall may close at 4 o'clock. Additionally, you can, if you do drop something off at City Hall, you could also give it to Chris Henningsen. He does work in the office and he's the engineer on the project.
Great, thank you, Sarah. As far as email transmission, is there a deadline on a time deadline on those dates that I mentioned, the 18th, the 25th, and June 1st?
4 o'clock is our typical close of office.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending today and providing your testimony and input and screen shares. I'm glad we all learned that today. I'm going to go ahead and close the public hearing. As I mentioned, Tim's laughing. As I mentioned, the record is open. First round, May 18, second round, May 25th, and then applicant final testimony, written argument on June 1st. I appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you later.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting and the recording.
Guess I'll see you tomorrow, Stephanie.
Yeah. See you tomorrow,
Bye-bye.
Larry.